Good afternoon, and welcome to the YMCA of Greater Seattle's Y Community Conversation entitled Disability Justice Defined and COVID's Impact. We begin by acknowledging the ancestral keepers of the land we gather on today. We thank them for their immense contributions to our state, our local history, our culture, economy, and identity as Washingtonians. At the WISE Equity and Justice Center of Excellence, we are working hard on leading with love as learners and understanding how to shift our practices and policies to center diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to do more than simply share words like diversity, equity, inclusion. At YGS's Equity and Justice Center of Excellence, we are working towards action steps that transform our everyday practices. This means we're learning how to obtain community voice and decision-making, how to think from an intersectional lens to ensure that those most impacted in the center are how we shift our work and we're also learning how to become stronger listeners, hearing one another with love, patience, and compassion. The Y Community Conversation is part of the Y series of events focusing on Disability Justice Month and was created in partnership with the Y's Disability Justice Employee Resource Group in collaboration with the YMCA of Greater Seattle's Equity and Justice Center of Excellence and made possible in part by our learning partners. I've been thinking lately about how we use words to justify our actions rather than actions to justify our words. I hope that makes sense. What I mean is those most negatively impacted by systems like education systems or housing systems or healthcare systems or workplace systems, those who are going to be cold and wet tonight because housing is unaffordable and unattainable. Those who are going to be alone tonight because they're ostracized and harmed. Those who will go hungry tonight because we've commodified and monopolized the food industry. Those who will not be able to breathe fresh air tonight because we are concerned about corporate greed more than the earth that sustains us. Those who are blocked from critical access to systems through mass incarceration practices. They are victims of a country that knows how to use words so well, a country that can throw out words like equity, disproportionality, inclusion, most impacted, but cannot back up its vocabulary with its actions. Systems intentionally do not allow those who live with harm and trauma and pain daily to drive solutions and access. You see, words to justify our actions rather than actions to justify our words. This is why we have community conversations, to transform our thinking, our ways of being, and to push us into more interconnectedness and accountability. Writer and educator and community organizer for disability justice, Mia Mingus shares, quote, "With disability justice, we want to move away from the myth of independence, that everyone can and should be able to do everything on their own. I am not fighting for independence as much of the disability rights movement rallies behind. I am fighting for an interdependence that embraces need and tells the truth. No one does it on their own, and the myth of independence is just that, a myth." In today's panel discussion, our panelists will delve into what disability justice really means and how it is different than disability rights or disability inclusion. Our panelists today will help us understand the truths of those with disabilities from an intersectional lens and will help us reimagine a world where we truly take actions towards co-liberation and co-conspiracy. Thank you for joining us today and being willing to open up your hearts and minds. Now, just a few kind of housekeeping pieces. We will have a chat. That chat will go directly to our YGS staff. Questions will go to Q&A, so please share any questions to Q&A and chat. We have everyone muted at this point in time except our panelists. Now I would like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon and share that Eileen Horst will be doing our CART captioning today. Panelists and audience, please help Eileen by speaking slowly. Today, I'm honored to share our moderator, April Snow, pronouns she, her. April started her career working in healthcare, assisting the elderly and people with disabilities before discovering by accident that she was really good at fixing and designing the architecture of databases. She has made a change to nonprofit work where she could make a difference in people's lives and now has 20 years of nonprofit experience. April is a self-professed nerd working in donor operations, databases, and prospect research. She loves to solve problems and sees databases as puzzles. She currently uses these talents to run the Donor Services Department for the YMCA of Greater Seattle. As a disabled person, social justice and disability justice are important to her. She serves as the chair of the YMCA of Greater Seattle's Intersectional Disability Resource Network and is involved with the committee creating the YUSA National Emerging Disability Employee Resource Network and serves as a co-chair with the Disabilities Commission. We have one more slide to show, and then we will welcome April. We wanted to ensure that there was an access note so that you know, as you're part of this, that people come in different body shapes and sizes. People can be moving and lying in this picture, for example, sitting in many different configurations. Some have mobility equipment in this picture. One has a service dog, and one is pushing a baby stroller. The person who actually put this up, Lydia XC Brown, said that their favorite is the person lying horizontally flat on the ground, the person that's actively spoke to their emotions and feelings. Please today use this space as you are, as comfortable, make yourself as comfortable as you can for your own body and mind and thinking, and really think about what you're carrying or bringing into this space today. Thank you and welcome, April.
Hi, as Indira said, I'm April Snow and I'm moderating this event. Welcome again to the Disability Justice and Y Community Conversation entitled Understanding Disability, Justice, and the COVID Endemic. Today's Y Community Conversations will help increase knowledge of the term disability justice and the history of the movement, centering QTBIPOC, who began and continue to be integral to the movement. Our panelists will define the term visible and invisible disabilities and will help us connect how COVID continues to affect disabled communities in a variety of systems: housing, jobs, medical, education systems. This community conversation will share ways in which racially equitable systems can redesign themselves to effectively support, nourish, and create beautiful spaces for those with disabilities to thrive. Before we jump into the conversation, let me take a moment and introduce our guest panelists for this afternoon. I'm excited to welcome Tay Zonde, a People's Choice Award-nominated, YouTube award-winning, Webby award-winning singer-songwriter, voice talent, brand spokesperson, advocate, host, and digital industry veteran, seen in more than 1 billion YouTube views. Then we have Dorian Taylor, Manager of Disability Justice, King County OESJ. Then we move to Naomi Natsuhara, Grants and Contracts Manager, Solid Ground. Let's get to know our panelists a little better. We would like to provide space for each panelist to introduce themselves, the role they serve in, preferred pronouns, and to share the work they are doing. Naomi.
Hi, I'm Naomi Natsuhara. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the grants and contracts manager at Solid Ground, and I'm also a Yonsei or fourth generation multiracial Japanese American and a writer, an advocate, and a lifelong learner who has mental health disabilities. So I'm really excited and thankful to be in community and learning with you all today.
Tay?
Oh, there we go. I'm unmuted. I'm Tay Zonde, pronouns he, him, artist, advocate. I'm autistic, coming to you from the land of the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Snoqualmie, and I've tried to use some of the fortune that I've had in life to raise visibility both to autism, sensory sensitivities, and my own mental health disabilities.
And Dorian.
Hi, my name is Dorian Taylor. I am first and foremost a community activist and abolitionist and disability and racial equity. I work at King County at the Office of Disability. I'm at the Office of Equity and Social Justice as a disability specialist. I'm on a couple of boards for the Rainbow Center and the Disability Rights Washington. I came into this work just straight up from a grassroots level. I lifelong neurodivergent, but I'm also physically disabled. I acquired my paraplegic through police violence, and that's how I ended up in this work. So just a little bit about me.
Thank you. Now let's shift to some specific questions that will enable us to understand both the urgency and opportunities inherent in seeing the issues through an intersectional and equity lens. Mia Mingus states, disability justice work is new in the sense that we're building the shared political framework and shared language. Mia talks about how justice goes beyond simply creating access to centering disability in various systems of oppression. Can you help us understand what the words disability justice mean as a complete movement? Tay, do you want to do this one?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of discourse in public understanding around visible disabilities. And, when we see the policies, the signs, nomenclature to engage physical disabilities, there's less awareness of that many people have a myriad of different invisible disabilities. Speaking from my own experience, I'm autistic. I have hyperacusis, so I'm very sensitive to sound, very sensitive to touch, and the ways in which embodiment can be affected, in which visible embodiment can be affected by invisible disabilities, is a conversation that is not as active as it should be. And I think that disability justice for me begins with being able to have a conversation that not every disability manifests as a visible phenotype, as what anthropologists would call it, what sociologists would call it, that invisible disabilities affect the way that people embody themselves, affect the way that they are viewed by what Nick Walker would speak to in her book Neuroqueer Heresies as neurotypical society. You might be neurodivergent or have other invisible disabilities, that there's a different backstory to your embodiment, and then there's a different need, a different educational need to arrive at a place of empathy and arrive at a place of belonging in society as a result of that.
Dorian, would you like to answer this one too?
Yeah, I would. So I have a little different experience with it as a person who, I grew up in institutions from 8 to 18 and was 31 before I acquired physical disabilities. And I believe that, first of all, disability justice begins with being able to be comfortable being a part of the community. People have to hide themselves. And that's why, personally, I like to push back a little bit on the terms invisible and visible, because I can't mask what's invisible. And I'm 43. I've spent a majority of my life learning how to hide myself and how to mask myself. And if it was invisible, I wouldn't be able to mask those things. Like I have been called unmotivated and lazy, and as a result of my disabilities that aren't as apparent as my physical disabilities. As a Black person, I'm a first generation out of Jim Crow segregation on both sides of my family. And it is still to this day, because of the anti-Blackness that's intertwined in ableism, we have a community of people, it's still largely white people who are comfortable identifying as disabled, whether it be visible or hidden, what it is, whatever. And that has to do with police violence and other forms of violence. And so we can't truly have justice until we're all able to be comfortable identifying as a part of the community, especially now since with long COVID, we're actually entering a world where most of the population is going to be disabled. So like justice for me starts with comfortable. We can all like be comfortable with being ourselves and not having to hide who we are.
Thank you. I feel some of that myself when speaking of invisible disabilities. I'm also neurodivergent and have physical disabilities, which I forgot to say earlier. Naomi?
Yeah, I think, in addition to a lot of what's been said, I think there's a, big systems transformation piece. It's not, just about creating, greater accessibility and inclusion. I think those are very important steps, but I think that there's also like a bigger, movement toward transforming those systems, creating new things, and alternatives that are really built by and driven by the folks that, have not had a voice in how a lot of our systems are currently structured. So it's also about, building community, being in community with other folks and being in solidarity with, a lot of other folks, Black folks, Indigenous communities, folks of color, et cetera, who are also, impacted by disability and need to be a part of those conversations and creating those spaces. So I think the last thing that I'll say is just kind of calling back to some of what was said at the beginning around that interdependence piece. I think it's really kind of integral. I think it can be very isolating for a lot of people who have disabilities, and it's disrupting a little bit of that, isolation that's created by ableism, and building community with other people to both, grow and support your immediate needs and be able to take care of yourself. But it's also, working with them to build movement toward those bigger systems changes. So.
Thank you. The next question Dorian touched on a bit, but what are visible and invisible disabilities, and what are some of the key ways in which spaces can work to include disability justice for both visible and invisible disabilities? Naomi, you want to start with this one?
Sure, I can keep talking. So I think, visible and invisible disabilities, or apparent and non-apparent disability, has a lot to do with how others perceive you, and whether your disability is something that they can, assess, I guess, or whether it's readily apparent to them. That might be based on your appearance or your accommodations. And some folks don't really have as much, I guess they're not able to not appear disabled to other people. Whereas there are some folks that you may not know that they have a disability unless they choose to share that with you. And then I think that there's also folks that have disabilities that might not be immediately apparent or always apparent, but if you're in a certain situation or you're experiencing, more severe symptoms or what have you, then it, becomes more apparent to other people. And then, I think one of the things that I've heard recently, and I've been hearing more, which I appreciate, is some of the messaging around kind of engaging as you need or as you prefer, including this community conversation, which I appreciated. And I think that's a very simple thing, but it's just like publicly acknowledging and naming that, all of us engage in different ways and need different things to be, in a space or part of a conversation or in a community. And that's, folks with disabilities, and that's folks with different learning styles or communication styles or preferences. So I think it's something that, benefits all of us.
Thank you. Dorian?
Do you mind? I heard it, but just cognitively, do you mind going over the question one more time?
Yes, of course. What are visible and invisible disabilities? And what are some of the key ways in which spaces can work to include disability justice for both visible and invisible disabilities?
That's a great question. And I really appreciate that question. Like I said before, I have both visible and not visible, disabilities. And and I think it first of all, depending on the space, right? If it's a space that multiple people are coming in, and you may not know the people who are involved, and you can't ask, and I think it's important to just assume, because everywhere you go, there's always going to be disabled people in that space. Whether they identify that or not. So I think it's safe to assume that if you're accommodating with quiet spaces or not overhead lights, things that because I know from my personal experience, right? I will go into a place and people will be super excited because it's physically accessible. But that is actually not if a place is physically accessible, that's not what makes a place hard for me. I myself also have hyperacusis. I can't deal with overhead lighting, or fluorescent lights. The sounds of the fluorescent lights, So a lot of times they'll have the accessible seating will be right up front right by the speakers, right over the head. So it's cool. Physically it's accessible, but I still can't access that space because most people involved have ignored the fact that there probably are people who have intersections of, disabilities you can see and disabilities that you can't see. So how do we accommodate a person who can't handle loud sounds, but also, needs a ramp, for example? So that's why I say accessibility as an afterthought is the opposite of inclusion, because you have to put deep thought and empathy into the space to include everybody in there. And if we can send people on the moon, we can create access. We just have to be able to work with people and understand that, people aren't there because you haven't made space for them to be there.
Thank you. And Tay?
Yeah, I think another big aspect of this is the ways in which the pathology paradigm of disease, of public policy has informed the ways that we process the concept of disability. And by that, I mean the tendency in the case of autism, the pathology paradigm would be part of the very problematic legacy of mental health care, and the ways in which marginalized persons and marginalized embodiments tend to be diagnosed as conditions, as problems, as non-normative, that are then in need of conversion therapy, in need of treatment, in need of medication in order to become more normal. This is a big dialogue with regard to autism, and there's still a huge movement with regard to ABA and other conversion therapy and pathology paradigm articulations of what autism is, that you'll look for autism-related jobs on LinkedIn, and they'll be like, oh, there are 30 positions for quote-unquote ABA therapists to do conversion therapy, which is different than the neurodiversity paradigm, different than the direction that we're trying to go in terms of affirming intersectionality. And so I think a big part of understanding the ways that visibility and invisibility is regulated is understanding the ways in which sometimes STEM fields, sometimes science and medicine specifically, has been weaponized to validate narratives in which marginalized persons are simply marginalized, simply non-normative, and not needing to be welcomed as equals, not needing to be embodied. And part of that is related to capitalism and the notion of rational individualism, rational choice, and the idea that individuals are free to make their own choices. One perhaps a little bit more grounded example is I'm wearing a chain right now. And for a lot of my life, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't do that because that's a stereotype, because that will put me in danger, because that will be, cause me to be seen in certain ways. And then I started doing like, oh, wait, I have had a lifelong sensitivity to touch. I've had a lifelong sensitivity to sound and many other autistic sensitivities as a person with autism. And this is actually a stim for me. This is actually something that causes me to be able to embody myself and bring comfort to that lifelong anxiety that I've had. And yet, when it comes to a discourse on visibility and invisibility, nobody sees that. Nobody looks at it like, oh, he's wearing a chain because he has an invisible disability, and this is what he needs to embody himself. They see other narratives, perhaps derived from a pathology paradigm.
Thank you. The next question is, health status and disability are not always linked. However, for people who have various comorbidities, have they experienced an increase in medical discrimination through policies and practices with COVID? Are there barriers or system failures that are preventing people with disabilities from getting equitable and fair treatment? Dorian, do you want to start with this one?
Yes. Actually, I have a lot to say about this. I also have lupus, and I deal with a chronic illness, and I acquired my physical disability from the police while seeking medical care at a hospital. So I was denied medical care, and that also has to do with a lot of the intersections of being Black. I was seen more as a female at the time, and had a history of mental illness. And so, long story short, was assaulted. And so I've been paying very close attention since that happened in my life 11 years ago to the medical industrial complex and how it is very much just a different form of the same type of white supremacist systems. And so all COVID has really done is enhance that. I think the language of eugenics and the talk of eugenics has it's gotten more in common language, and people don't see that. I think words like suffering from, when people say you're suffering from something, I think that's eugenics, because if they view your life as suffering, then ending your life is doing you a favor. And so we've seen in COVID, like, who gets to get treatment and who doesn't get to get treatment. I've also seen this outside of COVID. Unfortunately, I lose a friend about once a year to being denied medical care, on the intersections of, being middle-aged, most often people of color, or fat, and not having really good insurance. And so with the capacities at hospitals, that's just happening more and more. I can give a personal example. This summer, I was dealing with cholestatic hepatitis, a kidney infection, and a lupus and flare-up at the same time. And they wouldn't admit me in the hospital because I hadn't eaten in many days or anything like that. But the hospital, it was COVID capacity. And so they just sent me home. And I had to organize. We just actually, Leah Lakshmi, who did a video with that, organized. It was on the other side of the country, had to organize with her and some other friends to keep me alive, because they wouldn't admit me into the hospital, because as a single trans Black middle-aged person, my life isn't as worth saving as, like, say, a 20-year-old. So that I unfortunately has just seen an increase of that with COVID.
Sorry, that one. Naomi, do you want to answer next?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the medical discrimination piece has been covered very thoroughly, and like unfortunately, yeah, it's not new that it's happening. It's just like very much been highlighted because our current medical healthcare system has been pushed like to its capacity. It really does create this dynamic where then there are very subjective discriminatory decisions being made about who gets access to that care and whether, you know, there is a perceived quality of life, which is, you know, just the fact that there's any individual making that decision anywhere for anyone else is really upsetting in a very deep way. And then I just think also just in addition to all of that, just some of the resistance to mask mandates or, you know, safety guidelines that have been put in place. It's just this very overwhelming message that, you know, disabled folks are not the priority. They're not valued. They're not being taken care of. And it's, you know, in addition to just the physical isolation of COVID, it's very isolating to just feel like nobody cares about your well-being or your safety or your life. So.
Tay.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the comments by Naomi and Dorian, and also just speak to personal experience in the ways in which oftentimes these spaces in medical facilities, hospitals, they are not designed to accommodate sensory sensitive human beings. I might be in a doctor's office, and again, the light has an obnoxiously loud, high-pitched buzz that, for me, it's almost like it hits my entire body almost like a taser. Like it's just, if I don't have earplugs in or some other type of accommodation, I'm not able to exist in that space. And so many times, there isn't even anybody in the organization, there isn't even anybody in the institution to field those types of questions, to engage the topic of sensory accommodation or allowing people with sensory sensitivities to embody themselves. And that's endemic throughout all medical facilities and practices. So.
Thank you. And then the last question we have is, some workplace disability justice experts have shared clear ways in which to alter practices to shift systems of oppression and recreate systems that people with disabilities can thrive in. Can you share what you see as the most critical system changes that need to happen? Tay, do you want to start with this one? I know you just talked.
I was just reading a text, so can you repeat the question?
Yes,
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Some workplace disability justice experts have shared clear ways in which to alter practices to shift systems of oppression and recreate systems that people with disabilities can thrive in. Can you share what you see as the most critical system changes that need to happen?
I think, number one, just empowering people who are neurodivergent, neurodiverse. There's a certain narrative, maybe I sometimes call it the village people narrative of diversity and inclusion, that, you can arrive at a certain phenotype, a certain aesthetic of what appears from a political standpoint, from a clout-chasing standpoint, to be the way forward, the dividend of the civil rights movement. That's the vision of diversity and inclusion, and neurodivergent individuals and people with a multitude of different embodiments and different disabilities are not included in that. And, I think the first step is to seek out, to empower, to put some of those individuals who are marginalized in those ways in charge, and to trust them and to allow them to make decisions with regard to anything as broad as construction, patient intake policy. A lot of these things, you really need somebody who has these experiences to be an expert on that topic.
Sorry, Naomi?
Yeah, I think a lot of our workplaces tend to recreate the kind of larger, more institutional system dynamics that are at play. And so I think it's really important that that shift is happening. Equity work within organizations is great, but I think it needs to be happening at both of those, all of the levels, really, for it to be effective and sustained change. And I think that Tay talked about this a little bit, but the narrative piece of who's telling the story, who has a seat at the table or is, has the loudest voice in the room. And, are we centering folks with disabilities, and are we also doing the work ourselves that we're able to build trust with those folks and hear them and understand them, and then be accountable to what they've asked for with action. And I think a really critical narrative change piece is changing kind of our cultural value around work and productivity and profit. Because it's a huge driver, obviously, in the workplace. But it, creates this situation where folks feel this tremendous pressure to sacrifice their health, their well-being, their, ability to take care of their own needs in order to, meet that deadline or, make that quarter's profit margins. I don't know business words, but I think that there's a big shift that needs to happen there, because I've also heard a ton of just self-care talk and here's a handout on breathing exercises to take care of yourself during COVID. And that is all well and good to put that out there. But when folks are not getting a message consistently that their health and their safety is the priority, it's really hard to take time to do that and to take care of yourself in that way. And I think the last thing I'll say is that COVID is really pushed a lot of our systems to be way more flexible than they've ever been. There have been, expansions to public benefits or waivers for restrictions to public benefits. There's been, just even stuff like telecommuting and hybrid schedules, or the fact that when you're sick, you are encouraged to stay home rather than push through it and come to the office and get things done, which hasn't always been the norm. So I think that we're in a really crucial moment to be okay, we've seen how things could be, and they don't have to be the way they've always been, which has been, really violent and oppressive systems. And so it's a really important moment for us to kind of continue pushing toward that and think about what we can build in its place.
Okay. I'm sorry. Dorian, did I already have you answer this one? There's my neurodivergency coming out. Okay.
It is all good. It's all good. And so there was such good answers. Do you mind giving me the question one more time? I was really.
Of course. Okay. Some workplace disability justice experts have shared clear ways in which to alter practices to shift systems of oppression and recreate systems that people with disabilities can thrive in. Can you share what you see as the most critical systems changes that need to happen?
That's a really good question. And I just started working full-time again a year ago for the first time in almost 2 decades. Really just started working again about a couple of years ago. And I worked in this nonprofit that is known for its social justice values. And it was probably one of the most ableist environments I've ever experienced in my life. And that tends to be, and Naomi mentioned this, the co-opting of language. And I think, well, first of all, I'm going to pull it back a little bit. And if we really think about in a capitalist society, disability is really just a person's perceived ability to earn capital or not. And that's what makes a disability visible or invisible. And that's really, what it boils down to. And so because of that, that work is already like a violent environment in the sense that you're encouraged to hide yourself, and this society that is like based on how much you do and how much you produce is the antithesis of disability justice. So you can't really mix the two. You could just really try to take, like, the ADA is the floor, and you can really just try to take it off the floor and sort of meet somewhere in the middle by like creating, policies that can sort of like work around, folks. What makes the job that I have now accessible is the fact that because of COVID, I don't have to go into the office, or I can work when I'm in a flare up. I can't live in the city because of my sound stuff. So I live rurally, so it'd be like an hour and a half commute into work every day, anyway. Like, there's all of these things that would make work inaccessible for me. But I'm also able to work at a pace that allows me to produce in ways that work for my neurodivergence and my chronic illness. And so therefore I am able to work in this environment and meet margins in ways that work for me and my body. And I also actively, if like my job is going to talk this language, then I will push back, right? If you talk this language about resting and taking care of yourself, well, I'm tired, I'm resting right now, the work is always going to be there, and I'm in a position to do that. And I understand that's not always the case, but I think that like work environments like have to learn how to adapt to the people around them. But that, I feel like, it's just really hard to do as long as capitalism exists. I just don't think we'll be able to create disability justice in a work environment unless it is a social justice environment from the beginning.
Thank you. That was our last question, but I have a couple of ad hoc questions that I want to add. Some of what you said made me think about, in the workplace for disabled people, whether it's invisible or visible. I myself have a physical disability that I can't hide. And sometimes I have a cane and sometimes I'm in a wheelchair. Right. And so I've worked in some pretty toxic places where I felt like even though I had to, I didn't have to because people could see it, but like disclosing the disability and how people who have invisible ones maybe feel like they can't disclose. And I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts around that. And I myself over the years have gotten to the point where I'm able to speak out and talk about my visible and invisible ones. I, advocate for myself in accommodations and things that I might need, but not everybody can do that. And so do you guys have any thoughts?
I can speak to that, in terms of my own life journey, mental health care journey. I was first diagnosed as autistic when it was called Asperger's back in the 1990s, but I didn't know that there was any narrative and at that time, and it's now called autism spectrum disorder, that, I wasn't really re-diagnosed until I recommitted to psychiatric care, at the age of 38 or so. And so I went through a lot of my life having sensory sensitivities and disabilities and trying to, mask in situations that were not accommodating, not even knowing that there was a language of neurodivergence, not even knowing that, there was a diagnosis and multiple diagnoses that I could own, whether it's dyspraxia, which is kind of a brain-body disconnect in the way that I embody myself physically, that all of these things that, the world would just kind of call quirks were actually, part of my own experience. So I would say, today, I try as much as I can to not mask my disability, but that's also a privilege. That's also something that's both a risk and a privilege. And I've been very lucky to be at least able to scrape by in doing that. But I think there are so many people out there who do not have that privilege, who could lose their job, who could lose promotions, who could be judged pathologically as lazy or as confrontational or as unprofessional or as some other type of unwelcome dissent or barrier to capitalist accumulation, capitalist profit making, what they call KPIs in workplaces, key performance indicators, if they choose to own their disability. And so that's something we definitely need to have a conversation about from a policy standpoint, from a civil rights standpoint, from there's so much talk and in many cases hot air about individual rights and personal rights. And I don't ever really hear neurodivergent people centered in a lot of those conversations.
Anybody else? Okay, we do have a couple of audience questions that I'm going to go ahead and ask. And sorry, they're on the side, so I'm going to be looking over here. From Jordan, what tips or strategies do you have for managers to create an enjoyable, maybe even positive working environment for their neurodiverse team? Anybody want to answer this, or should I call on
people? Can you repeat the question?
Yes. What tips or strategies do you have for managers to create an enjoyable, maybe even positive working environment for their neurodiverse team?
Listen to people. Every time a manager asks me what I need for my neurosensitivities, neurodiversity, or my sound sensitivity, anything, I never get accommodated on that. I only get accommodated on my physical disabilities. I think it's like a little too much for jobs to understand that there might be more than one. So I just like, whatever is the most, like I tend to, because I need physical accommodations as far as like typing and stuff goes too. So I think at first, just from my experience, it starts by just listening to what a person needs.
Thank you. Naomi, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think that for me, it's been a lot about just, I think there's a big trust piece to, like, especially in a workplace where they're, especially if it's not the most supportive environment, if you do not feel like someone has your back, you don't always feel safe asking for accommodation. So building that trust and, like, being able to hear, as Dorian was saying, like, hear what someone is asking for and then be able to act on it. Like, I had a conversation with someone recently, and most of the conversation was them sharing how they were feeling and the barriers that they were experiencing. And that was really helpful for me before trying to, as a manager, as a coworker, you sometimes just want to jump in and fix it immediately. But I think that was a really important piece of the conversation for me, was just like being able to hear like what was going on and how it was impacting this person. And then working together on like, okay, what are like some of the next steps that we can take? So I think there's it's just a lot of conversation and building trust to be able to really understand what is needed and then be able to follow up on it.
Tay?
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that I'd say is that we need to affirm the validity of self-diagnosis. A lot of times when you ask for an accommodation at a workplace, they're kind of asking you for, well, show me your freedom papers. Show me who has made you a card-carrying person who is neurodivergent. And not everybody has the privilege. I have the privilege to have a top-of-the-line psychiatrist and get top-of-the-line cognitive battery tests, and actually ask the person who did my cognitive battery testing to write a workplace accommodation letter saying, hey, this person may need sunglasses because they're sensitive to light. This person may need noise-canceling earbuds or noise-canceling headphones because they are sensitive to sound. A lot of people are not able to access the capitalist version of freedom papers to validate their real experience of marginalization and disability. And so we really need to have a conversation about, well, how do we affirm the rights of people who might not have had that privilege, who might be self-diagnosing and still have need that is just as valid, just as real, and just as in need of accommodation.
Yeah, and I think I also, the accommodation process is sometimes itself, even for those that do have access to that sort of thing, is a very inaccessible process. Okay, so the next question is from Greg. And what ways can disability justice impact long-term care, end-of-life issues, and quality of life for older adults through community action or legislation, etc.?
If you don't mind, I'd like to answer this question. So one of the goals of disability justice is to not have to rely on systems like legislation anymore. Because having further like government control over our lives, kind of like as a mentioned, right? Like who even gets access to certain care depends on who has access to certain diagnosis and certain medical things, and if legislation is involved, then that's what's going to happen. I think community and mutual aid and is going to be first and foremost, because we talk about access. We don't have a world that's accessible to aging. We don't have a world that's accessible to people getting older. There's no spaces for people who have, whose memory is changing. What we do is incarcerate them essentially and isolate them and segregate them into these like assisted living in these age only 55 and up communities. And it's really just, in my opinion, another form of isolation and segregation. So I think how we are going to do that is first and foremost by creating access to spaces for aging, which is something that I'm starting to think about. We don't have a world that is geared towards that.
Any thoughts, Tay?
Maybe Naomi, I had a thought, but like the
okay.
train just kind of, but it'll come back to me.
Okay. Naomi?
Well, I'm still gathering my thoughts, so bear with me a little bit. But I do think that, to Dorian's point, like legislative stuff takes, like, even if it ultimately results in like increased investment or resources for folks, like it takes time, and it takes a lot of time. And I don't think that we necessarily want to wait for that. There are people who need care and who need support now. So I think I would really just reiterate kind of that community support system, those, forms of mutual aid or what have you, where it is, us taking care of each other. And again, kind of a value shift, because again, I think it's all coming back full circle, capitalism and the fact that a lot of our aging population may not be in the workforce. There may be, they may or they may not be, or they may be working different hours, but again, they become not a priority because they're not contributing to that production and that profit. So there's a value shift that's definitely needed. But I do think that, for right now, we got to kind of take care of us. So.
Yeah, and to Dorian's point as well, it kind of made me think, well, okay, the ways in which there are axes of marginalization and discrimination that we just accept, like ageism, we just normalize it. Well, okay, as you get older, you're going to have fewer opportunities, and maybe you won't be what is part of the mainstream narrative of what's considered sexually attractive, what anthropologists call the halo effect, where if you are more attractive, you get lighter sentences in court, you have more work opportunities. disabilities. This is very heavily documented. Even something like height. People earn more money for every inch of height, and to me that's outrageous. That's the data has been there for decades and decades, and there isn't really any awareness or any public outrage. Like, wait, this is a problem, and this is something that we need to fight with. So I often question, like, are there ways to build coalitions with some of these marginalizations that have just been normalized, that sometimes destroy people's lives, with neurodiversity and the admittedly problematic term of invisible disabilities, and understand that there is a broad swath of marginalizations that can potentially be in coalition towards advocating policy change, advocating a better future.
Okay, the next one is from Kimber. And how would you navigate the duality of unlearning your own internalized ableism in order to acknowledge and own your place in the disability community, while also recognizing that disability is a huge umbrella and some folks are impacted much more than others when it comes to access barriers? Essentially, how do you navigate being part of the community yourself, but also being an ally to other disabled people whose experience is different and perhaps more challenging from yours? Go ahead, Dorian.
Yeah, for me personally, experiencing, like, maybe if I'm in like a community of, say, folks with just in a spinal cord injury community, there aren't a lot of people with cognitive disabilities like myself or neurodivergent, and who are neurodivergent, and there's sort of like a hierarchy that that gets created in people's minds. Well, I'm not this person. Well, I'm not this, and I'm not that. And I think I like to see what privileges I have, and take a step back and make sure that folks that don't have those privileges are getting a chance to speak and getting a chance to sit, and getting some of the same opportunities that I have, and I often, because of I'm sorry, I lose language sometimes. I'm starting to lose my words, but I think that like, as mentioned before, the different, like, spectrums that you've got, the visible and invisible. A lot of times there is a hierarchy with people with physical disabilities and no cognitive disabilities being on top, because the world is more geared towards that. But then there's might be more. There might be more, like, say, I've experienced more discrimination in looking for jobs because of having physical disabilities. I'll get in through the first interview, and then I disclose if it's in person, and when I try to find out if it's accessible, and then I don't get a second interview. But when I'm in the door at a place and then my cognitive disabilities come up, then I get no accommodations typically around that. And so that's because, like, people with cognitive disabilities, intellectual disabilities, typically they are like lower on the chain. And so I think it's important for people, because I don't like to use the words more challenging for myself, because I think pity is disrespectful. So I personally, I just think, like, people who are traditionally more marginalized and people have more intersections of disabilities than I have. Sorry, I'm really having a hard time pulling out words.
And I just, real quick, I'm very sorry about that. My family just started vacuuming, so I'm gonna mute myself. But before does anyone else have thoughts on this that they want to talk about? Okay, I'll move on to, this is the last question from the audience. And this is from Madrian. If I'm a neurotypical parent to a neurodivergent child, coming from a community with little education resources on neurodiversity, any suggestions on books, articles, podcasts, sources for information for parents, caregivers, or educators? I want to better understand the community, celebrate my child, and provide healthy opportunities for education, therapy, community building, etc. Also looking for information from POC resource lenses.
I can try to answer that. But my favorite book right now, I mentioned it earlier, is Neuroqueer Heresies by Nick Walker. Which she's an amazing scholar, and I learned a tremendous amount. It was almost kind of like words were being taken from my life experience, and though it's not my memoir, it ended up being very autobiographical. And it's a book that I wish I had access to 20 years ago. But one thing that she says in that book is, I think she quotes Carl Deutsch, power is the ability to afford not to learn. And, the more you're able to educate yourself about neurodivergent authors, people who've already spoken to that experience. There are a lot of adults who grew up experiencing some of these things that, perhaps autistic children may be experiencing. And so I think the more you're able to plug into those resources, the more that can give a perspective.
I'm muted. Naomi or Dorian, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm not good at remembering the name of resources. I'm one of those people that bookmarks things and I read it and then I unbookmark it and it's gone forever. So sorry.
Same.
Yeah, I might be able to answer that question tomorrow when they come back, but not right now off the top of my head, But yeah, there are lots of great resources out there for sure. It's just I can't think of them right now.
Okay, that was the last audience question. I want to thank you for being with us here today. We hope this has been meaningful, and we invite you to share your feedback with us using the link that's being shared in the chat box. And then we would love it if you could think of one word or a quote which really resonated with you about today's conversation and share that in the chat box as well. We invite you to explore our resources shared in today's PowerPoint. We will share a recorded copy of this video with the resources from the PowerPoint slides with all that attended or registered for this community conversation. We invite you to our future Y community events in November as we explore the Y Indigenous Native Heritage Month. Our Heritage Month offerings are free and open to all. Thank you for joining us and stay safe.